wasn't able to spend as much time with you guys as with the first cohort, because I actually was sort of a student myself the first time through for many of the sessions. But from what I hear, there's this question of which cohort was the better, and not a big question, but I would say, I don't want to give it away, but I would say both the instructors were genuinely impressed by you guys, and so thank you all for your participation. We're grateful to have you. Yes. Very nice. And I did want to say that you'll all be invited back next year. We're planning for next year now, and we are going to be organizing the material in a different way. It'll still be about the American founding ideas and principles and original documents and all that stuff, but it'll be kind of a different template and different content, and so you would be able, hopefully, to follow that. I will have to warn you that the stipends will be a little lower. We're going to be doubling our numbers next year of students, so sorry about that, but we sort of have a mission to get the word out, but still, it'll be good content and a good time, and so we'll certainly love to see you guys back if you're interested, and you'll be getting an invitation from us sometime in the fall. I want to take a minute to thank folks, Linda Arndt and Esmeralda Shea, who are not in the room, but I forgot to get them in, and I'm going to drag them in here. Yeah, they're very helpful, and to me and Esmeralda, I know. Interacted with a lot of you, and so I want to certainly take a minute to thank them. And our instruction team is this is very awkward. I'm just doing it in the most awkward possible way. Thank you, Linda. And Esmeralda, I will convey your thanks to her in a minute. Our instruction team is led by Adam Seagrave in the middle there, who you heard from, I guess, this morning, and very lucky to have him with us from teachingamericanhistory.org. So they have awesome resources you guys all have access to as part of this programming, and I hope you take advantage of that. And Jason Anderson, can't say enough about Jason, and he's here. You teachers get up early, and every time I got here, I try to get early, get a little bit ahead of time. He's always here, so he's always the first here and the last to leave, and so really good content and very helpful to me. And our instructors, Alyssa Cortez, Khalil Habib, and Josh Palladino, also assistant project director for the grant, and Jeff Paulette. I think Jeff's here. Yeah, no, wait, where's Jeff? Anyway, and Eric Pullen. Yeah, he had to leave. That's right. Eric Pullen, who also left early. Very, very pleased with their efforts, and so thanks to all of you guys, and thanks to Dr. R.J. Prestritto, who we'll be hearing more from in a few minutes, and to my boss, Peter Kortansky, who I'll introduce in a minute, who also has paid for lunch every day. So a special note of thanks to you, because the federal government does not allow, or the Department of Education does not allow any funds for food. So thank you, Peter, for helping us out there. I did want to just cover a couple administrative things before we get to our keynote speaker today. One is the stipend. So the stipend is in 2 waves, as you know, and so the first portion, Monday morning, Linda will be submitting the paperwork for that. So keep an eye out for that. I think I have never yet seen this process from your side, so I don't actually know what goes on, but you'll have to kind of do something and keep the ball rolling. So if you run into any problems, contact me or Linda about it, and we'll get right on it. As you know from Jason, there will be this follow-up lesson plan stuff you guys are going to be doing. Everybody's been organized into groups. No one has said a peep to me about any questions or anything, so I know that's well in hand. But if you do have any questions, certainly reach out to me and Jason about that. The second stipend will be processed when that's finished, probably the first week, at the latest, first week of Okay, thank you all again. Really, your participation has made this a success, so thank you. And I hope you have a great rest of the summer. Let me introduce my boss. To introduce our speaker then, Peter Kortansky is the director of the Center for Civics, Culture, and Society. I think we need to move this up higher so that it competes with Ashland University. Anyway, yeah, he's the director of the center and my boss, and we've just been up and running for a year, so a lot has happened for us, including this grant. He, along with Jeff Paulette, put the grant together, and we're successful in getting that for 3 years, so we're very pleased about that. And we're just starting to offer courses now at Cleveland State University. Last semester was the first course we offered. Dr. Kortansky received his PhD from the University of Toronto, where I met him. He was in philosophy, I was in political science. He was for a long time at the University of Prince Edward Island, where he was chair of both the philosophy and the religion departments. He's the author of several books. He's a Thomist and a Thomas Aquinas scholar, so very interesting to talk to about free will and punishment and all kinds of theological and philosophical questions. So happy to introduce him to you, and he's going to introduce our speaker. Peter?
Okay, thanks, Tom. Yeah, as Tom mentioned, I am the director of this center that is sponsoring this whole event that you're participating in. Really, the center was created in 2023 by the Ohio General Assembly, and really for 3 purposes. The first was to correct for what is very obviously an extreme lack of civics knowledge among Ohio and more broadly American high school and university students. Really adults as well. When Jeff Paulette and I were writing this grant together, of course we had the unpleasant experience of having to unearth some of these very disturbing statistics that our high school and grade school and again, university age Americans just know very little about the founding and about the core principles of the country that we call home. So we're trying to reverse that. It's also, the center was also created to promote the intellectual diversity back among public institutions in the state of Ohio. There had been a perception, at least, that these universities had been sort of become intellectually homogeneous, and that there's been a kind of a lack of robust debate representing both sides of the most controversial issues of the day. And so that's one of our purposes is to restore some modicum of intellectual diversity in the academy, and then also to promote civil discourse and the free exchange of ideas, which there really can never be enough of, right? And I think that probably you don't have to be a teacher, although as teachers, I'm sure you see this up close and personal every day, of the great problem that in this country, we really just have kind of forgotten how to talk to each other. And that is such a tragedy and again, something that we're trying to reintroduce into the general curriculum of a public university education. And I think that's really one of the reasons that we started this program, is because we really want, and not just want, but we really need you as teachers to be our partners in that effort. And we greatly value your being here this past week in order to really lock arms with us and to take on this really great cultural problem that we have in restoring our students' ability to, again, just talk to each other, to be able to sit across from a table with one another and disagree without becoming disagreeable, to learn how to engage in conversations about controversial topics in a forum where the only recognized authority is, again, not your favorite philosopher or your favorite religious authority, but where the only recognized authority is reason itself. And that is not something that necessarily comes naturally to people. And of course, before they get to us, they're going to be with you. And so we want to, again, to really recognize you guys as partners in this mission that we're trying to pursue. So we at the center believe that the antidote to all these problems is essentially two things. First, really just what you've been doing this past week, to return to the foundational documents of the American tradition, the American founding. And secondly, to be able to read those documents together around a table, much like what you've been doing all week, and to cultivate that skill of going through a very complicated but very profound text with one another, and really thinking about how you might teach your students to start to begin to acquire that skill as well. And so before I introduce our main speaker, I just would like to very humbly ask you for two favors. The first is to go back to your schools and tell your colleagues about us. As Tom mentioned, we're going to double our numbers next summer. We certainly would like to see you back, but we would also like to see a lot of new faces back. And assuming your experience was a good one here this past week, please tell your colleagues about what we're doing here and encourage them to apply for these and other events that we might be doing. And the second is just to talk not just to your colleagues, but to your students about the center, and to tell them that there is something new at Cleveland State University. There is something very new there that there was nothing like it before, where the way that we're teaching, the seminars, the focus upon primary documents and foundational texts really takes center stage. And if you like what you've been doing this past week, and you think some of your students would like that same kind of learning, please tell them to consider the Center for Civics, Culture, and Society, and also Cleveland State University. We really appreciate that. Okay, well, let me get to the main event here to introduce our speaker, Professor Ronald Prestritto, who is the author and the editor or co-editor of 8 books. 4 of those books are on the American founding: Modern America and the Legacy of the Founding, Challenges to the American Founding, Slavery, Historicism, and Progressivism in the 19th Century, The American Founding and the Social Compact, and Founding the Criminal Law, Punishment and the Political Thought in the Origins of America. His other 4 books also address American politics and American political thought on the subject of Woodrow Wilson and the Progressive Era, something I think he's going to speak to you a little bit about today, published between 2005 and 2021. In addition, he's published numerous scholarly articles on the American founding and other topics connected to American political thought. He received his PhD in 1996 from Claremont Graduate School and has been teaching a variety of academic appointments since that time. Since 2010, Dr. Prestritto has served as Graduate Dean of Hillsdale College. In 2012, he became full professor there, and he's held a variety of leadership positions in the wider academic world, most notably as Senior Fellow of the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. So we are delighted to welcome here to Northeastern Ohio, and please join me in doing
Okay, thank you very much. Did you have to mention the year that I earned my PhD? But otherwise, thank you for that very, very generous introduction, and certainly a pleasure to be here and to be asked to kind of cap off this week that you have had studying the great texts of the founding, learning certainly from some top professors, some of whom are my colleagues, some of whom used to be students of mine. So I was told that I had to do a better job than the speaker from a couple of weeks ago, who went on for I think over an hour. So I'm going to go on for over 2 hours to make sure I really exceed that. But no, I'm going to keep my remarks I think certainly much briefer than that, and then we'll have some time I took a look in preparing for this talk. I took a look at the curriculum that you've had. Obviously, I wanted to build a little bit off of that in my own remarks to close things down. And I thought, as interesting as and important as learning about all these core founding principles is, obviously I think it's important. As mentioned, I've written quite a bit about it. I'm sure the question that has crossed many of your minds is, okay, well, this stuff is really old, and is it any longer relevant to us today? How much do these principles really still apply in our own world of contemporary politics? To what extent have they been replaced by other, perhaps very different principles, newer principles, right? You obviously don't have to be the most attentive person to kind of see that politics today functions in many respects very differently than the original vision that you've learned a lot about this week. So, what happened? Might be an interesting question. And in order to be good teachers, of course, we want to try to understand at least all sides of what it is that we are presenting to our students. So, having spent all this time looking at the Founders' Principles, I thought it might be of some value, and consulting with Dr. Powers, kind of close by getting out the perspective of the most serious and impactful critics of those principles that you've been learning. And in our history, certainly that would be the great progressive intellectuals and also political figures that came around the turn of the 20th century. That's actually kind of marks the movement in my own scholarship. I studied the founding for some time and just kind of became interested in what happened after that, and that led me to the progressives. These are figures that came around the turn of the 20th century, at least to begin with. They had, I think, as much impact on the political world that you see around you today, certainly as did our original founders. And I think that impact came principally from offering what can fairly be called a kind of competing vision of government to that which had been put forward by our founders. I think the story is that the progressives were ultimately partly but not fully successful in replacing the founders' system of government and replacing the founders' principles. And I think that's one major reason why today understanding how government works can be so confounding, because it is basically a kind of jumble of what we inherited from the founders combined with the very different ideas that we have inherited from their progressive critics. And it can be quite challenging to try to sort that out. So I'm hoping my remarks today can help you kind of round out what you have been talking about this week, put it together as you navigate looking at what's going on in politics today around you. So I'll try to say a few things about how those principles of the founding fare as we go through the progressive era, but then also about how certain features of government today reflect this fundamental clash of ideas. Right? You can just see it, most major issues that you look at, there's this war of ideas going on, and it's got a long history to it. So, okay, so if a good bit of what we see in politics today can be traced, at least indirectly, to the criticisms made of the founders by the American progressives, then I think you can understand, or hopefully can understand, why it is that the progressive movement is actually something that's received a good bit of attention of late among scholars, and that's very much a change from the way it used to be. That's really only been the case for the last 10 or 20 years. The progressive era was not a considerable interest really outside of a small group of historians and even in a much smaller group of political scientists. So, but again, so much, Dr. Kortansky alluded to this in his introduction. The political debate in the country today is very poisonous in many respects, and I think one of the reasons for that is you just have two very fundamentally different ideas clashing, and it's true we don't really know how to talk about them very well. So we talk about the progressive criticism or the progressive departure. Much of that departure, much of what's changed in our government, our way of thinking about government, is due to the ordinary passage of time. Just as simple as that. It's due to the onset of circumstances, the onset of exigencies that could not possibly have been foreseen hundreds of years ago. Right? And that the founders themselves got that. Like they saw that inevitability perfectly well. Right? So it's not like they're thinking, well, this, we've perfected everything, in perpetuity, nothing should ever change. That's not the way they thought. As you saw from your curriculum this week, however, in spite of that recognition, there were certain core principles, certain fundamental ideas that were understood by them to be permanent, that were meant to endure through the unforeseeable exigencies of coming historical events. And that's because they believed, of course, like much of the Western tradition of thought of which they were a part, that they reflected, that these core political ideas were grounded in the very nature of man. And thus, they had certain first principles of government that were understood by them to be applicable to all men and all times, to borrow the words that Abraham Lincoln once used to describe the founders' ideas. Right? If any of you recognize that letter about Thomas Jefferson, the famous letter that Lincoln wrote. But as I've said, that way of thinking about politics, these timeless ideas, these enduring ideas, that way of thinking obviously does not prevail today, and that's where the progressivism comes in. So this word, progressivism or progressive, it's a word that's used a lot in politics, if you just pay any attention to the news. This is partly because, again, speaking of my age, I can remember the national political debates of the 1980s, I regret to say. And if you remember those, you know that the term liberal became a kind of dirty word in the 1980s, right? That's the way we used to refer to the politics of the left, so someone's a liberal. But politicians on the right, Reagan especially, kind of successfully turned that into something that you did not want to be called. Ask Michael Dukakis about that. And so in the new millennium, instead, those who once called themselves liberals really have turned to the term progressive instead. And on the one level, that's a kind of repackaging of things. That's fine. There's a lot. That's just part of politics. But it goes deeper than that, and it did go deeper than that because many of the progressive politicians actually pointed to the original progressive era as the source of their principles. Hillary Clinton referenced specifically Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt as the inspirations for her progressivism in the 2008 presidential primary debates. And then not too long after, President Obama launched the major economic initiative in really the major economic vision of his first term in a little place called Osawatomie, Kansas. And you say, okay, well, who cares about that place? Well, that's where Teddy Roosevelt, had given his famous New Nationalism speech. in 1910, and they took great pains to connect their vision to that speech. And so you had a very open connection to progressivism, and this, I think, is also what has helped to turn many of our political disputes today into debates about core principles, right? And so I'll come back to these at the end of my remarks, but we start in the progressive era itself. Historically, let's look back. What was progressivism? What did it mean to subscribe to that point of view or to be a progressive? In short, it's a frustrating thing when you use the dictionary. They use the word itself in the definition, which is confusing, but it's an argument to progress, I suppose, or to move beyond, to get over, to move forward from the political ideas of the American Constitution and the American founding, to move beyond the very principles that you all have been learning about over this past week. Okay, so it's an argument to have a much more powerful, much more robust role for the national government, and to do that for the purpose of responding to a set of social and economic conditions that, as the progressives contended, basically could not have been envisioned at the founding. And therefore, the founders' limited kind of constitutional government was really not up to the job anymore. It was inadequate for these new circumstances and these new pressures, these new realities, right? So as times change, as circumstances change, our principles of government must also change to reflect that. That's basically the core progressive philosophy. It's an historically contingent philosophy, right? Right and wrong, just and unjust, depend upon. There's no single answer to that. It's contingent on or dependent on what the circumstances are. So the founders had this permanent understanding of just government, at least at its core, not the details, but the core basic principles. And that's because they had this permanent understanding of human nature. And the progressives said, no, we think the ends of government, the scope of government, these are things that have to be defined anew in each historical period. So you've got historical contingency coupled with a deep faith in historical progress, right? That things are getting better, that human beings are getting better, that human nature is getting better. And the idea is that because of that evolution, because of that improvement, government was therefore becoming less of a danger to the governed and more capable of solving more problems, that we can do more and do more safely and competently with the power of the state. We don't have to worry about the old threats that we once worried about. And historically, I'm a political theorist by training, so I talk about ideas like progressivism. Historians talk about eras, they like dates, which I'm notoriously sloppy with. My friends who are historians remind me. So I just talk around like about the 1880s through about the 1920s. And that's about as precise as I will get. But they're manifesting themselves in the writings and speeches of the likes of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Crowley, John Dewey. If you're educators, you've probably come across John Dewey's name, perhaps regretfully. Robert La Follette, people like that, Hiram Johnson. And the progressive era was really the first major period in American political development to feature as a primary characteristic the open and direct criticism of the Constitution. Okay. Now, obviously, criticism of the Constitution is something you can find anywhere in American history, including during the period where we were debating the Constitution. But what's different about the progressive era is it's the dominant thing from the most important thinkers and politicians. Right? That's what they are. It really forms the backbone of the entire movement. So, given the deep dive that you all have been taking this week into the works of the founders, I think we should get a little more deeply into this contrast between the core principles of the founders and the progressives, starting with the American Declaration of Independence, which you've been studying, and also we're celebrating a big anniversary of it this very year here, actually just a few days away, specifically. So think in particular about the transhistorical nature of the Declaration's opening, right? And by that I mean it says, hey, the purpose and the role of government, again, is not dependent on this or that historical circumstance. Instead, if you want to know what just government is, there's a single answer to that question, and it's applicable to all human beings by virtue of the fact that they have a human nature. In particular, the Declaration says that the purpose of government, or the purpose for which governments are instituted among men, to use the precise language, is to secure certain unalienable rights. And these rights, what do they mean by putting it that way, right? They mean that these rights don't come from a particular regime or a particular tradition. You don't have rights because government gives them to you. You have them because you were created as a human being. And therefore, the rights don't vary from one point to another. You get a different political regime in, and now you have different rights. You don't have the ones you used to have, you have other ones. That's not how it works. So, rights are granted instead, the Declaration says, by our Creator, and therefore entitle us to a government that will protect these rights, which are said to come from the laws of nature and of nature's God. Okay. So you have those principles from the Declaration. I'm sure you've heard a little bit about those. Next question would be, how do these principles of the Declaration shape the 1787 Constitution? So this proposition of the Declaration, right, that the purpose or that the end of government is to secure the natural rights of citizens, therefore makes it imperative that the government not only have the power to do its job, but also that it is restrained and checked very carefully. Because the power that you give it, right, it's constantly a danger that the power that you give it to do its job can also be used by, let's say, the majority in a democratic society to infringe upon the natural rights of the minority. And if that's the case, then you really haven't given the kind of government that the Declaration requires, because why would the minority ever agree to give up any of their natural rights and sign up for that kind of deal? Right? So you have to be careful that the power of the state could be used or could be employed to the detriment of the rights of some other individual or some individual citizens. So this is why for the founders, the greatest threat in a democratic society was the threat of what they call faction. That, in other words, that a majority might use its power to violate the rights of the minority, and therefore the majorities, even though they were entitled to govern, had to be limited or bounded in the ways that they could deploy that power. And government itself, one way that this was to be done, government itself is restrained by a variety of mechanics, essentially. If you think of the institutional arrangements of the Constitution, they're a little peculiar, right? And there's a reason for that. Thinking here especially of the Federalist Papers, number 6, number 10. The emphasis there, very important point about faction, is that its threat is a permanent threat. Right? This is a threat that is not going to go away. It's not going to diminish with time. It's not going to diminish with the march of history. Why? Because faction is grounded in human nature. Right? Federalist 10, the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, writes James Madison. Federalist 6, Publius, the pen name used by Hamilton and Madison, criticizes those who fail to see that the dangers of human nature are there permanently. that they've been there, and the examples that are cited, they've noted in the Federalist Papers you've read, lots of examples from antiquity, as well as from more contemporary examples, and the point is to show the continuity, right? Human beings are the same kind of thing throughout, right? And if you deny that, if you think the dangers of faction are not permanent, then Hamilton says you must be far gone in utopian speculations, which is a charge that if he had been around during the progressive era, that's what he would have said about the progressives, right? That they are utopians, right? Now, to this basic outlook on the problem of government, the progressives, they saw it very differently. Okay, they basically countered with this idea of historical contingency that I have described, right? They said, the founders have this ahistorical account of human nature. And the progressives say, no, we think that the scope of government, the role of just government, the meaning of just government, has to be defined by the different principles of different epochs. And therefore, it really is impossible to speak of a single form of just government for all ages. And so you couple historical contingency with faith in progress, and the belief was of the progressives that the human condition improves as history marches forward. What does that mean as a practical matter, right? To kind of take that utopian outlook on human nature. Practically, that means that the protections that had been built into the Constitution to guard against the danger of things like faction, like majority tyranny, those protections, those limits, become less necessary as we become better as human beings. They become less, we're less of a danger to ourselves. And in fact, they become more unjust. They become more unjust. And ultimately, the problem of faction, as the progressives see it, is solved not by permanently limiting government. It's solved by history itself. The forward movement of history solves this problem, right? That we want the majority to rule, but the majority might rule in ways that are adverse to the common good or adverse to the rights of the minority. But if we get better, if history improves us as human beings, then maybe that problem kind of goes away. And we need to worry less about those constitutional mechanisms that are put in place to deal with it. Now, where did that idea come from of the progressives? That forward motion of history idea, right? So if the natural rights principles of the founding had their roots in the Western tradition of political philosophy, right? The founders just didn't make that up. They were educated in the 17th century and earlier, the principles of natural law and natural rights. Well, also the critique of those principles comes from likewise from those who came later and who are also influenced by the tradition of political philosophy that prevailed in their own day. And the progressive movement in particular became the means by which German political philosophy, German historicism, was imported into the American political tradition. And fear not, I'm not going to talk about that. It's after lunch. I want to keep you awake, best I can, anyways. But suffice to say that the influence of 19th century German political thought is evident not only from looking at the ideas that the progressives promoted and espoused, but also if you just look at the historical pedigree of the most influential progressive thinkers. Right? Almost all of America's most prominent progressives were educated in Germany or had as teachers those who were educated in Germany in the middle of the 19th century. And that fact alone reflects a kind of sea change that had occurred in American higher education in the second half of the 19th century. This was a time when most Americans who wanted an advanced degree went to Europe to get it, and often went to Germany to get it. And so by 1900, the faculties of American colleges and the faculties of American universities were very, very different than they had looked even 50 years before them. They had become populated with European-educated PhDs, and also, not coincidentally, with the historical thinking which dominated the European academy, especially the German academy, in the 19th century. That came to permeate American higher education. A great example is Johns Hopkins University. What people don't know, that was actually founded in the 1870s, 1876, I think. Take the risk of giving a precise date. It was established for the express purpose of bringing the German educational model to the United States. That's how that university got started. It produced several prominent progressives, including Woodrow Wilson, John Dewey, Frederick Jackson Turner, another name I'm sure you have heard of and perhaps read. And even outside of Hopkins, the historical, evolutionary, progressive mode of thinking was sweeping through American higher education. This was at the time when many of our homegrown progressives were being educated in these institutions. And I think we can attribute the influence of these new ideas to at least two central figures, to Hegel and to Spencer. And this means Darwin too, basically by way of Spencer, if you know that genealogy. Both of these figures had very important connections with the founding of the various social sciences right around this period in American history. Many of the social sciences were launched in the very latter part of the 19th century. Certainly the history of the political science, my social science, fits this pattern. Woodrow Wilson was president of the APSA, the American Political Science Association. Frank Goodenow, another prominent progressive, was a founding president of the APSA. So that the upshot of it is that that broad philosophic influence that came through that education on the progressives made them fierce critics of the founding era principle of social compact, right? Which I'm sure you've learned a bit about, right? So just as the 19th century political philosophers had been reacting against what had preceded them in the centuries prior, right? So the 19th century Germans were critiquing the social compact philosophers from the 17th and 18th century, John Locke and the like. The founders did believe in many respects, like John Locke, the great Whig English political philosopher, that men as individuals possessed rights by nature. These were rights that any just government was bound to uphold. These are rights that stood as inherent limits to the authority of the state over individual liberty and especially over property. Now, as a practical matter, the aims of progressive politicians, the regulatory aims, the redistributive aims, they were on a collision course with the political principles of the founding. Right? The progressives understood that their agenda wasn't going to get anywhere in a world where the principles of John Locke or James Madison prevailed. Right? That was just the practical reality on the ground. Woodrow Wilson, who I'm going to talk about here, among the progressives, I think, saw this conflict very, very clearly, understood it very well. And most, of course, are familiar with Wilson, I suppose, because he was the 28th president of the United States. It's a presidency known most for its stewardship of American involvement in the First World War and for the securing of the peace in the aftermath of the war, for Wilson's failed attempt, it turns out, to sign America on to the League of Nations. But he also served a partial term as governor of New Jersey. I don't know if anyone here is from New Jersey, but Wilson is in your history if you are. He did that right before he became president in 1912. What a lot of people don't realize is that in addition to all of the kind of political life that Wilson had, he had been a prolific scholar and a very successful and prominent academic for over 2 decades. And He was, in fact, the only professional political scientist ever to become president of the United States, the only PhD president, and I will leave it to your own judgment as to whether or not that is good or bad. So I have my own views on that. I know lots of political science PhDs. But, you know, while Wilson's presidency, I think, certainly helped to launch a variety of landmark revisions in the framework of American government, the Federal Reserve, the income tax, to name just a couple of small examples. But the ideas that came from his academic work, I think, were at least as influential on future waves of liberalism in the course of the 20th and now 21st century in American politics. Specifically, as I said, Wilson understood very well that the progressive vision for government, the progressive program, could not be fulfilled so long as the country remained committed to the founders' political philosophy. And this understanding makes understandable, I think, Wilson's admonition that he gave in an address ostensibly honoring Thomas Jefferson, where he said, if you want to understand the real Declaration of Independence, do not repeat the preface. When I came across this admonition of Wilson's, it was given in a 1911 speech to the Jefferson Club of Los Angeles, I was confused because of his reference to the preface of the Declaration. So here I was a PhD, and I'd studied the American founding, and I didn't realize the Declaration of Independence had a preface. Because to me, preface means, if you read a book, the preface is kind of an unimportant thing, that might be thanking your mom or whoever. And no, what Wilson means by the preface is the part probably that you all spent the most time talking about. All men are created equal, they're endowed by their creator with certain, that part, that's the preface. So Wilson says, if you want to understand the real Declaration, do not repeat the preface. And so if we took Wilson's advice, what would it do? It would turn our attention away from the timelessness of the Declaration's principles to what? What's left in the Declaration? The litany of grievances, the specific things that George III was or was not doing at that specific time. And Wilson's point is really quite obvious, right? Those principles were tied to that time, those events, those challenges. We're in a different time. We have a different set of challenges. We need different principles. Right? That's what he meant. It was a merely practical document. So once circumstances change, so too must our conception of government. And so I'm going to rely here on Wilson to unpack a couple of more basic things about the progressive critique of the founders' ideas. Right? Not because he's the only important one, although of course, since he's the one I've written most about, he's most important to me. You could, I must concede, also look at Theodore Roosevelt, or as I said, a figure, again, many of you perhaps have more knowledge of than you wish to have, John Dewey, if you've gone through education coursework. But I do think that Wilson is the clearest in terms of bringing out this basic contrast between the founders' ideas and the new ideas. And because he's both a leading intellectual and a leading politician, a leading statesman, which is somewhat unusual. I think he was probably America's most prominent critic of the basic design of the U.S. Constitution. And again, I know you've had several of the Federalist Papers on your reading list this week. So you know from that those papers argue that again, the greatest threat in any democratic society is majority faction, right? That a majority part would rule only for the sake of its own part, as opposed to for the common good, the sake of the whole. Right? That's the problem. And so that's the reason why we have these kind of odd mechanisms, like the separation of powers that were put into the system, right, to check the tendency of majorities to rule for their own sake, not for the good of all. For Wilson, that system of separated powers, which sort of is the framework of the whole Constitution, that system was really the source of much of what was wrong with American government. Right? Wilson wanted a democratic system that would very efficiently translate current public will into government action. Right? You have an election, and the people are of some view, they express that view, and very quickly the government implements it. Right? That's democracy, as Wilson and the progressives saw it. And instead, you have the separation of power system, which, as Wilson understood it, was essentially designed to protect the people from themselves, from their own worst elements of their nature, and to do so by throwing up as many obstacles as possible to the implementation of their will. Right? And if you think about the process for how a bill becomes a law, or what it takes actually to make it, to implement policy in this country, it's really rather circuitous. And it's hard even sometimes for people from other democratic societies to understand why it is we go through this maze of procedure. And Wilson thought that the system really serves not Republican ends, small Republican ends, but it impedes them. Right? And so he advocates, and the progressives advocate, breaking down the walls between these branches, breaking down some of these barriers, making it simpler, allow the branches to work in much closer coordination so that they can constantly adjust policy to where public opinion is at. And Wilson spoke about all of this when he ran for president successfully in 1912. It was actually a book which you can get if you really are a glutton for punishment, called The New Freedom, which was published in 1913. It's a collection of his campaign speeches from the previous year. You actually can find them on radio. I realize this, the 1912 president, you can get TR, Debs, Taft, all of them on radio. They actually come across much better on radio than they do when you read them, for whatever reason. At least that was my impression. But in one of his speeches, very famously, Wilson made some important and telling comments about the separation of powers and about the framers' intent for the Constitution. So he said something, well, he said exactly the following. The makers of our federal Constitution read Montesquieu with true scientific enthusiasm. The government was to exist and move by virtue of the efficacy of checks and balances. The trouble with that theory is that government is not a machine, but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. It is modified by its environment, necessitated by its tasks, shaped to its functions by the sheer pressure of life. No living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live. Right? That's kind of a well-known speech from 1912. So in that way of thinking, right, the environment changes, the environmental stimuli change, and this living organism adapts in order to survive. And so you can see kind of in the air and the water at the time affecting the progressives, you have some Darwinism, you have some Hegelianism, and they're mixing the language. And sometimes it's without a lot of philosophic precision, but that's fine, it's clear enough. Right? The new Constitution, the upshot is, the old Constitution is inadequate for new times and new conditions. So you could think maybe after the fashion of the complaints one often hears in politics today, about gridlock, government never gets anything. Elections come and go, and the government never actually does anything. Wilson says, hey, the separation of power system doesn't work. Okay? It's both inefficient and it's irresponsible. inefficient and irresponsible. The system is inefficient because it prevents government from solving problems. It prevents government from adjusting to meet the new circumstances of the new day. Instead, all this time is wasted with the various organs of government busy attacking one another and struggling against one another. And it's exactly how Madison puts it in 51, right? Ambition counteracting ambition. It's like, yeah, they did this on purpose. Wilson's like, this is crazy. Why would you do something like that? It's irresponsible. The system's irresponsible from the progressive point of view because it becomes very difficult for the government to make new policy even when that new policy reflects a clear new direction in public opinion. Right? In this respect, our system is very unlike the parliamentary model, right? Which Wilson greatly preferred, the parliamentary model. Right? Everything comes out of the legislature, essentially, the pure parliamentary model. You elect the legislature, and the executive is constituted out of the leadership of the legislature, so that by definition, there's no separation. Many parliamentary models are hybrids of that. They don't all work quite like that, but that's basically a pure version. And Wilson loved that. He was an Anglophile in that respect. And you get changes in public opinion, and you instantly get a change in government, and separation of powers gets in the way of all that and upsets all that. Right? You just don't get that kind of responsiveness. So, based on his objection to the separation of powers, based on his general objection to the founders' understanding of government, Wilson puts forth a series of institutional proposals, reform ideas that were designed in one way or another to overcome this kind of fixed mechanistic. That's what he means by, say, Newton, the law, like the laws of universal laws of physics. That's how he viewed the Constitution. It's a very mechanistic thing. So we have to overcome that. And his substitute for the separation of powers under the Constitution is something he called the separation of politics and administration. And what does that mean? So he thinks under the founders' design that politics had become unresponsive to public opinion. It was too divided. So on the one hand, the progressives wanted to democratize politics. They want to get rid of the distance. They want to get rid of the indirectness between public opinion and governing. They want to get rid of the constitutional restraints, checks and balances, and so forth and so on. So they proposed making democracy more direct, right, more immediately tied to public opinion. This is, you see this most effectively actually at the state level. So now many of you, you vote on ballot initiatives and referenda and so on. And those are all progressive mechanisms. They came out of the progressive era. So much more democratic, much more direct. We got to do that with politics. On the other hand, the progressives had much more faith in administration than they did in politics. Science had made great advances, of course, by this time. In thinking about it, Wilson observed that there were men like himself with good university educations. University educations were no longer just for the people who wanted to go into ministry. That used to be the only reason you go to college. But now you could have graduate degrees. You could have a lot of technical knowledge. You can learn all this new science, 19th century of science. And Wilson believed that national administration, right, in other words, the agencies within the federal bureaucracy, this would be the place in the future where real, rational, enlightened governing would take place. And so the idea was to empower national administration, and you would empower it by freeing it from the influence of the political institutions. So think of this is the Gilded Age, right? Think of the story with the Gilded Age is, national politics is kind of poisonous and corrupt and amateurish and so on. And you can see, if you think about that, where somebody like Wilson would have gotten this notion that if you want government to do anything good, keep the politicians out of it. Right? amateurs. They're low-dealing, self-interested, smoke-filled room, corrupt grifters. And that may help you think about or understand how Wilson would think that these politicians were simply going to interfere with the enlightened mission of national administration. And if you think of our own time, we often have the same mentality. Right? It's often seen as a bad thing when our legislatures involve themselves in decisions which some people believe ought to be made by experts. When Congress inserts itself into something that maybe people think, no, leave it to the enlightened administrators. When Congress tries to weigh in on things like environmental policies or healthcare policy, often it is suggested that this means special interests, narrow political interests, are gaining access to policy decisions that really ought to be made by those who know something, ought to be made by educated experts in the federal bureaucracy. So Wilson's idea of separating politics and administration, you keep the politicians over there, yeah, make them much more democratic and more directly elected and all of that, that's fine. But keep them away from the real decision making, which requires scientific knowledge, expertise, neutrality, objectivity. These other people are over here. So that obviously brings us to a kind of fundamental paradox. Because on the one hand, you want to empower public opinion. You want to have it give a much more direct impact into politics than what the founders had envisioned, because they were afraid of what the people would do. But politics, where you've now given the people more power, more say, more direct input, so it also becomes much less important, much less authoritative. Because the real power to do things, the real power for decision making, shifts out of politics and over into the realm of the enlightened administrators in the bureaucracy. Right? That's the shift, and it's kind of a paradox in progressivism. And the implications of that shift are really profound. Consent of the governed, right? I mean, here's the problem. Nobody likes politicians, okay? But where is it that we actually consent to how we are governed? Well, it turns out in the realm of politics, like we elect people to represent us. Right? So consent of the governed, which is a fundamental requirement of having a democratic society, comes in the realm of traditional politics. But the disparagement of politics in favor of enlightened administrators moves the focal point in government away from popular consent and into the hands of unelected experts. And that shift, I would suggest to you, is really the origin of American government today, where more policy, is certainly the case, that much more policy is made by federal agencies than by elected representatives. Many progressives, Wilson not least among them, had great faith in the possibilities for national administration, for what these experts could do for the common good if we would just let them, if we just get the politicians, that's to say the people you vote for, out of the way. Wilson wrote enthusiastically as a young man about the contribution to national affairs that could be made by himself and others like him who had elite university educations. Right? So again, you think about, he's the first PhD to become president. This is the age of the founding of the social sciences. Right? We can take our expertise, the social sciences, we can take our university expertise and put them at the disposal of the state. And the state can do good with it. You've got a lot of political corruption of that day. And so the progressives kind of were revolted by institutions like Congress. Congress seemed incapable of legislating for the national good. It was just mired in the muck, right? Sometimes I give a defense to my student, a defense of the smoke-filled room, but that's a different lecture. But that's sort of the picture you get, like some big fat cat smoking a cigar, behind closed doors. Wilson and his fellow progressives didn't like that. They wanted a new kind of national administration. They wanted it largely above the arena of popular consent. They wanted it charged with making the policy requisite for national progress. They wanted it staffed by university men like themselves, as opposed to these political operators of low character who dominated the ordinary institutions of government. So, because administration had to somehow be, therefore, liberated from the constraints of politics, Wilson's most serious academic work actually focused on developing a new approach to administration. This is something when you start to study is very exciting. Like if you have insomnia problems, you go and read some of these long tracts on bureaucracy, Wilson riffing on bureaucracy. I assure you, it's a cure for insomnia, but very important, right? Because it's I think fair to say that Wilson, in no small measure, is responsible for launching the whole discipline of public administration in the United States, and certainly for articulating the principles behind what we today call the modern administrative state, with its sprawling web of agencies. And again, for those of you involved in education, even at a state level, you know that there's a big, heavy bureaucratic administrative side to that. So Wilson relied very heavily on European sources for his study of administration. And the reason for this is very simple. This desire to free bureaucracy from politics and to give bureaucracy very robust powers over the details of legislation was an absolute novelty to the American constitutional tradition. And Wilson knew that, and he said it multiple times. He said, I can't go to American sources for this. I have to go to European ones. They're the only ones who think like this. And in fact, in one of his books, perhaps his most well-known book, Congressional Government, Wilson even complained that the greatest problem with Congress was that it spent too much of its energy legislating, when it should instead delegate the bulk of that legislative power to the administrative agencies where you had experts who actually knew how to use it. So this is how I think you can see the influence of Wilson and certainly of all of the progressives on yet another central feature that you will recognize about American political life, and that is that policymaking today in many of the greatest areas of national concern, environment, healthcare, financial regulation, so on and so forth, it's done primarily within or by agencies that are in the bureaucracy, to which Congress has delegated broad swaths of legislative authority. And you think of recent battles in our country on the environment and the rules for clean air, clean water, vaccine mandates, student loan forgiveness, many other hot political issues. Those issues have been debated and fought primarily not in Congress, where you have elected representatives who are supposed to represent your views. They have been fought instead in administrative agencies or in courts against administrative agencies, who've been exercising the power that has been given to them by Congress. And so, I'll wrap up. I won't belabor this, but I mention these current debates because I hope that by doing so, you can see how this battle over the core political ideas, this is still playing out in our own time, right? We're still dealing with the effects of this. You have rule by a separate and somewhat independent administrative apparatus, not fully independent. This came out of the progressive departure from the founder's separation of power system. That's how we got it. And in turn, that rejection of separation of powers was itself grounded in an even deeper critique by the progressives of the founders' basic political philosophy. So that's why I think, to really get a sense of government today, I think you have to understand this clash of ideas between the founding generation, which you spent the week learning about, and these great critics of the founders, the progressives, which I hope my remarks have at least helped to explain or introduce to you. So I will wrap it up there and love to take questions if we have time to do that.
Yeah, questions from folks? I'll start it off. Go ahead. Good. Yeah.
Right in front, yes,
Okay,
Lisa.
so you said that I know this is super simplification, but Wilson is basically the one that said we need to do things differently and we need to address politics differently, like he's the anti-politician, poli-sci guy. Is that a good thing to delegate so much? Because I teach AP Gov, and so a lot of times when I'm teaching Congress, I'm like, well, this is how the founders said it should happen. This is what we should expect. But Congress today doesn't operate that way. And you made the comment that there's the delegated authority or the rulemaking authority that we grant to these, the administrative state. Is there an assessment there that that's the proper thing, this departure?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So the argument for it is, or let's say, if the complaint is, well, gosh, how come Congress isn't making these rules? And the argument is, well, the federal government now, the things, its scope is well beyond the scope that was originally envisioned by the framers of the Constitution, and so Congress is not built to do it. Right or wrong, there's just a lot more rulemaking and regulating that goes on from the national government than was ever conceived of, and so Congress cannot do it. And so the agencies are there to, in recognition of that reality, would be the argument. And there are a couple of comebacks to that. Right? One would be, okay, is it given that the federal government needs to be doing all of this? Would we be better off leaving much of this to the states? Right? I mentioned Theodore Roosevelt briefly, and essentially the core point of his new nationalism was to take from the states much that the states had previously been doing, but in kind of patchwork ways, and that you needed to do things at a kind of uniform national level. And so, one could push back with, saying, no, the states, they exercise the traditional police power, right? Safety, health, and morals, and so on. The other critique would be the one I sort of intimated at. To the extent you do this, you have to think about how much you lose of the basic core values of a democratic government, because people in Congress, whatever you may think of them, this is always a hard sell, right? People just love Congress. It's like you think someone's a popular, well, Congress is really unpopular, but you vote for them, right? I mean, they, if they make rules, you can hold them to account by voting for them or not, or voting for their opponent, as the case may be. If someone in the FCC or the Federal Trade Commission or the National Labor Relations Board makes a policy, which they do all the time, that absolutely affects all of us. Think about the debate we had over vaccines during COVID. That was an OSHA policy. Okay? It was not enacted by Congress, because Congress doesn't actually have that power. It's a state power. Well, I bet many people in this room have pretty strong opinions one way or the other about that, right? And in a democratic society, you want those making those rules accountable to those of you who are sovereign, right? You're sovereign. Your voters. So that's I mean, that would be the other critique with delegation, is that you're not just delegating away, you know, sort of, hey, maybe we can give this to someone who actually is a little more expert, but you're really delegating away the you know, who it is that represents you. You know? So, anyways, I mean, that's the argument. So I weasel out 'cause I'm not going to answer the questions. I'm not supposed to do that. So. Yes.
I want to ask about a touchy subject,
Yep.
which is the association between the early progressives and eugenics.
Yep.
For eugenics. You quoted Wilson's speech, "What is Progress?" I believe, where he mentions Darwin, and you might say, well, he's just using Darwin as a stand-in for thinking metaphorically of government is a living thing, as opposed to the Newtonian model of checks and balances. But there is this very uncomfortable historical fact of Wilson and many other progressives being very much in favor of eugenics. And contemporary progressives put, you know, front and center the respect for consent, right, in all different ways. But it seems like, you know, the horrible aspect of eugenics is that it violates consent, right? So is there a, you could put this here weekly, does the progressive rejection of a kind of trans-historical human nature that would mean that we need to respect consent, does their rejection of that not only open the door to eugenics, but kind of invite that going down that road?
Yeah, I mean, you could say, I mean, once you lose your ground in human nature, then lots of things follow from that. And you know, when then the ground instead can shift under your feet, you know, the question then it has no ground. You know, I think that more broadly, this is related to the eugenics question. The other sort of scary thing about the progressive Wilson, especially, is the racial stuff, and he was known for resegregating the civil service and so on. And it's interesting there. It's treated in the better histories of Wilson, not so much in those written by his acolytes. But the common assumption, at least had been for some time, this is where I think having the progressives studied by political theorists actually helped a little bit, because the standard historical explanation for some of this stuff, whether it's eugenics or race, has been, well, you know, Wilson is a Southerner, and therefore he is, you know, he has the, you know, racial animus that's very typical of someone who grew up in the South, a partisan of the South, who's came up with the Democratic Party. But it turns out actually that's a standard historical account. It turns out to be mostly wrong, because Wilson says over and over again he was for the North. He thought the South was historically backwards. He thought the North was a side of progress. He liked Lincoln, whom he didn't understand very well, but he liked what he thought of Lincoln. And he just said, yeah, the South had to be defeated, and he was, you know, not the typical Southerner, in other ways. The racial stuff, the eugenics stuff, really comes from the German stuff.
Yeah.
That's the really dicey thing. That's where I could put the whole room to sleep. So I won't say too much about it. But I mean, this, you know, for you know, the philosophic antecedents that he was drawing from, progress takes place by way of the advance of certain races. I mean, that's how they talk about it. And they talk about, you know, historically superior races, and they have to subjugate the inferior ones. And he's getting that right from German political thought. And this goes all kinds of places in the 20th century that I don't have to paint a picture. You know, so yeah, that's the other thing. I mean, it's funny. I write about this stuff. I often, you know, I never lead with it in talks about Wilson the progressives, because as soon as you do, the air goes right out of the room. But since you asked,
Yeah. Sorry.
Since you asked, right. What else? Yes, sir.
Okay, so phase one of the founders, phase two of the progressives, phase three are all of these teachers in here today, getting ready to take all this back to their classroom, could you ever see a phase 3 down the road of American citizens going back to these core principles and perhaps demanding that the administrative state is elected? That the leaders of the administrations of those bureaucracies are elected individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a natural question to ask. Okay, if the complaint is that we have moved away from having decision makers who are accountable to voters, then what would be the way, given all of the complexities that we are confronted with today? I mean, what would be the way back or forward, or however you want to organize it? And you know, there are a few different ideas. I mean, ultimately, what you want, I mean, it seems to me, if you're a kind of critic of what's happened, then ultimately what you would want would be a way for somebody accountable to voters to have a final say over policies that are made. Like that would be, and so how could you do that? There are different ways you could think of. You could move the expertise of some of the expertise of the bureaucracy into the legislative branch, for example, right? So that in that Congress wouldn't instead vote and then be done and delegate its authority over to the bureaucracy, but instead all of that idea generation, all that expertise would be there, what, I don't know, in congressional staffs or something like that. And then, you know, the end result would be a legislative enactment where accountable officials would they would have to answer, right? You know, that's, I'm just throwing that out there. That's one possibility. You know, in state government, that's not so unusual because in many states, legislatures are part-time, right? I don't know if that's true of Ohio's. But many states are part-time, so they only meet a couple months out of the year, and that's even less time for a legislature to figure out what it wants to do. Well, but their staffs are often permanent, and so a lot of these states work is you have kind of permanent staffs, and they're there and they're kind of preparing legislation, and then okay, the legislature comes into session, and the legislators are kind of presented with, you know, hey, this is what we think you should do, and they can vote yes or no. I mean, it's not so far-fetched. I don't know. I mean, that's just, you know, we're really well down the road, and you know, I think the fact that we're even asking these questions today is at least a good development. You know, I'm sure there are other ways of thinking about it too. So this was somewhat difficult to talk about. I see everyone here is actually still awake, which I'm very, because no, you know, a lot of times when I should talk about, like, well, let's talk about bureaucracy and whatever. Oh, boom, oh, there goes the whole room. And also, when you're trying to explain things, okay, what examples are you using? Well, things agencies decide, and sometimes like really like watching paint dry. You know, it's a great administrative law case. What's the one, Paul, about, you know, if you want to call something peanut butter, does it need to have 87% or 90% peanuts? Like years and years in court over that kind of question. Okay. Then we went through the COVID pandemic. And then people had something to relate to, right? That it's affected all of us, right? Our livelihoods and, you know, daily comings and goings. And so that's a really useful way to talk about that. Okay, think about, okay, during COVID, right? Whatever you thought about the policies, okay, who was making those decisions? And the argument was, well, we have public health experts, and this is the time when you really want public health experts to be making these decisions, right? And not the legislators that don't know what they're doing. And so, you know, okay, how did that work out, and how do we feel about that, and what were the consequences of governing ourselves like that? People get that, like, oh yeah, I remember. You know, I lost my job, or I couldn't go here, or I couldn't go there, or I got sick, or whatever the case might be. And so it at least, it made it easier to talk about these things, and for people now it seems somewhat more receptive to this suggestion, hey, we should think about this, right? Is this how we want to do things or not? What else? Yeah? You're running the show, you do what you want.
I'd just like to ask you a little bit about the philosophical basis of the progressive movement that you mentioned earlier in your talk. And I was wondering how you would characterize them responding to the following criticism. And I know this is a simplified version of it, but you did mention that they thought that we needed to free ourselves from these timeless principles in order to open up the possibility for genuine progress, for things to get better as opposed to worse. But couldn't someone say that the very idea of getting better tacitly appealed to some timeless standard of right and wrong, or good
Yeah.
and bad?
Yeah.
And because without that, you're not really progressing, you're just changing according to some
Yeah.
arbitrary way.
Yeah, progress. Yeah, progress from what or toward what? Yeah, I mean, no. Though philosophically, I mean, this is problematic, and they're quite vague about it. Now, I mean, certainly the political philosophers who influenced the progressives were not so vague about it. But the way I talk about the progressives is they are manifesting what is in the air and the water at the turn of the 20th century. That if you look at the language, it's a mishmash of, I mean, those who train in political philosophy, you recognize the Darwin, you recognize Spencer, I recognize Hegel. Now, philosophically, to the challenger, right, these things don't all really hang together. Like, there are some really sort of irresolvable tensions, it seems, there. But the Wilsons and the TRs, they're well-educated men, and even some who are considered not progressives, but who are prominent during the progressive era, like Calvin Coolidge, or Taft, or people who were known actually as opponents of progressive policies. But they're still, if you read the things they're writing, they're using the general language of evolution, progress. They're not using the language of nature, of social compact, because they're not educated that way anymore. And that's just the glaring thing. When I first got into this, longer ago than I cared when I first started writing about this, and the first course I ever taught on it, I put a section of the course toward the end on progressive era conservatives, right? And so, about whom I knew very little, but I figured out by the time I got around to that part of the course, keeping a week ahead of the students, I'd figure it out. And so, who are the progressive era conservatives? Well, it's Taft and Coolidge and others like Elihu Root or Henry Cabot Lodge or whoever it was. And then I got to that section and I started reading the stuff. And, I see why this happened, because they're using the same terms. They're using the same references to history. They've abandoned, the conservatives have abandoned nature, and so I mean that to my mind. It doesn't mean that it's not interesting to try to disentangle the different philosophic influence. I mean, I waste a lot of my time doing that. But the progressives are really just kind of a reflection of the language of educated people of that time.
That sounds historicist.
Yes, it is.
Sorry.
Yes, you're right about that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. All right,
You want to
last
ask me a
Last
question?
listen.
All right.
Oh, I get the mic.
You better make it a good one, Paul.
Oh, well, I'll try my best, but thank you for the presentation. So following up on that, so would one critique of the progressives' historicism would be to ask them, do you mean for your historicism to be a permanent, timeless, unchanging principle that's now applicable to all times and places? The one unchanging thing is historicism itself? And isn't it true that there could be a corresponding criticism leveled at those who want to locate the progressives in a particular time and place, or as you put it, it was in the air and the water at that time among the Germans, and then it was imported here. But can't they say, this stuff of John Locke, that was in the air and the water of the time?
Yeah, right.
Okay,
Right.
and so that's so how do we resolve that? Because both camps can make a similar critique to each other philosophically.
Yeah.
Isn't it grounded in human nature, as you said, and what we believe about whether it's permanent and unchanging?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tom sort of intimated this in his slight against me for being a historicist. But I mean, ultimately, the idea of historical progress, that assertion is itself the assertion of some absolute way of thinking, and it suggests a certain paradox in historicist philosophy, which I think is kind of what you're getting at, and I think that in the context of the American progressives, that they don't think this is random. They don't think, well, we're just going to keep going and going. Most of them have a very definite idea of what the end looks like, of what the ultimate, nirvana, promised land, whatever you want to call it, looks like. They think we're close. We're not quite there yet, but it's just Wilson in this same essay, or same What is Progress, he's got this whole account of, we're almost there, we've got the foundation built, the house, you're almost there, it's almost going to be revealed. There's a lot of religious influence here, right? The progressives have been very bound up with social gospel, and it's about trying to realize a kingdom of God here on earth, made by the state. I mean, there's all of that going on, as you well know. There's all of that going on. So there's a lot of actually absolutism there, and so that is a paradox in their thought, and this is the problem you get when you have a room full of political philosophers. They like to try to really unwrap this stuff, so it can kind of get you away a little bit from just sort of the practical impact of it. But in any case, I mean, yeah, they have a very definite idea of where they're going, I think, by and large. So.
All right, well, thanks very much. We're going to have to wait for lots more questions to think about. So, thank you, Dr. Prestritto. Thank you again to my boss, Peter Kortansky, for lunch and for all your support from the center. And so just last word is, if you have questions about those lesson plans, get a hold of Jason. If you have questions about stipends or anything else, get a hold of me and or Linda Arth. And thank you all once again for helping us make this a success. And we look forward, hopefully, to seeing some of you next summer. All right, take care.